In this video, we're going to talk about two new addendums that are available to us through Florida Realtors. First is the credit related to the buyer-broker compensation. The second is the seller's agreement with respect to buyer-broker compensation. If you watch the video regarding the changes to the as-is contract, you'll note that FF and GG have been added, and those are the documents we're going to talk about today. First, we have the seller agreement with respect to the buyer-broker compensation. This is the top of the page. We're going to fill this out with the seller's names, and the buyer's name, the property address. The buyer and the seller are both going to initial this document. This seller's agreement with respect to buyer-broker compensation makes the contract being presented contingent upon either the seller-broker and buyer-broker or the seller and buyer-broker executing a compensation agreement with terms acceptable to the buyer within, if left blank, 3 days of the effective date. So in this instance, you're making this contract that you're presenting contingent upon either a seller broker to buyer broker or a seller to buyer broker compensation form being executed. If the compensation agreement described herein is not executed and delivered within the time period, the buyer may, within 3 days thereafter, deliver written notice to the seller terminating the contract, in which the deposit shall be refunded to the buyer, thereby releasing the buyer and seller from further obligation under this contract. If the buyer fails to timely deliver said written notice to the seller, this contingency shall have no further force or effect, meaning the contract is no longer contingent upon this agreement and the buyer is just going to move forward as if it's a presented offer. Next, we have the credit related to the buyer-broker compensation. So very similarly, obviously, the seller and buyer's names and the property address are going to go on the top of the page. The buyer and seller will ultimately initial this document. This is credit related to buyer-broker's compensation. It says the buyer has entered into a separate brokerage agreement as may be amended, a buyer-broker agreement, not incorporated herein by this reference with, and we're going to put the buyer broker name on this form. So basically this is just saying, I'm a buyer. I've already entered into an agreement with my buyer's agent. This is who my buyer broker is. The document goes on to say, at closing, the seller agrees to credit the buyer the sum or sums described below, which for disclosure purposes only the parties agree is related to the buyer obligation under the buyer-broker agreement to pay all or a portion of the buyer-broker's compensation. And they can ask for any variation here, a percentage of the purchase price, a dollar amount, or a percentage of the purchase price plus a dollar amount. And this is to go toward the buyer-broker obligation. The document goes on to say, in the event that the credit described above exceeds the amount allowed by the buyer's lender for any such contribution, then to the extent permitted by the buyer's lender, one of two things is going to happen. Either the balance of the credit paid by the seller will go to the buyer broker, or the balance of credit will be reduced to the max allowed by the lender. So it will be important to have that conversation with the lender prior to submitting this document. It goes on to say, in the event the credit described above exceeds the limit amount allowed by the buyer-broker agreement, then the credit will be adjusted to the amount allowed under the buyer-broker agreement as may be amended. Remember that a buyer's agent cannot earn more than is what is stated in the buyer-broker agreement. This second paragraph is restating that, but remember the buyer-broker agreement can be amended. Finally, this rider FF shall not modify the buyer-broker agreement or any other compensation agreement made between the seller-buyer, seller-broker, and or buyer-broker. Nothing in this rider FF requires the buyer or buyer-broker to provide a copy of the buyer-broker agreement to the seller or seller's broker. And again, we have that statement, broker compensations are not set by law and are fully negotiable. So this agreement does not modify a buyer-broker agreement or any other compensation agreements. The buyer or buyer-broker does not have to provide a copy of the buyer-broker agreement to the seller or the seller's broker. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us here at the association. And as always, you can reach out to the Florida Realtors legal hotline, which is free of charge with your dues.